I'm Ismael. In this video, I'll be demonstrating how to build a desktop for a budget. Therefore, I'll be using mostly used parts. For each computer part that I mentioned in this video, I would only discuss its general purpose and not go into depth. This is the non-gaming build. Now that being said, let's get to it. First, I want to cover safety. When working with electronic components, we can accidentally damage our component by statically discharging ourselves. There's many methods one can ground themselves online, and for me, I'll be using an anti-static wristband. On one end, you have a clip, and this clip, I'll be connecting it to my case. On the other end, you have to wrap around the wrist, and I'll be using this to make sure to keep my components safe. Also, along with anti-static wristband, you will also need a Phillips #2 screwdriver. This will be my first desktop build. Let's see how it goes. I'll begin with the motherboard. As you can see, it's inside its static bag. Whenever handling the motherboard, be careful where you place it. Avoid putting on conductive surface, as behind the motherboard there is metal pins, and if you put on a metal surface, you may short your motherboard. The purpose of the motherboard is to hold all of our components. We have RAM slots over here. We have our CPU socket on this end. And then we have our expansion slots right here. And then for the storage, we have the connections down here, or as well right here. And I'll go into thorough about each one in a moment. And now I'll show a closer look of the motherboard. This is another angle of the motherboard. Here we have the RAM slots, those gray and black. And then we have a CPU socket, expansion slots, and for storage would be these connections right here and one right there. Here I want to show a closer look of how the CPU socket looks like. There's a leverage right here that would allow you to open up this compartment. This version of the motherboard itself has the pins. Avoid bending them, as this is where your CPU makes contact with the motherboard. The purpose of the CPU is to execute the instructions of a computer program. Many consider the CPU as the brain of the computer. On the CPU, there's a small arrow on the bottom left, as you can see right there. You're going to make sure that this arrow matches with the arrow on your motherboard. You can always look at your motherboard's manual, just double check in which direction it needs to fit in. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the CPU. I'm going to carefully drop it in. It seems like the CPU is sitting well onto the socket. I'm going to go ahead and close the compartment. And there you go. I made another video where I demonstrate how to put on the stock fan. If you're interested in taking a look, I'll provide a link for that. So after the CPU was installed, I went ahead and tried to find where to connect my CPU fan. And this happens to be on this end of the motherboard, which is near the CPU. I'll go ahead and insert it right there. Next, we have the RAM. The reason we have the RAM is to temporarily store our data and program for the CPU to retrieve. Right here, I have 2 RAM sticks. Each one is 8 gigabytes. So RAMs come in different sizes and speeds. Just like the CPU is compatible to the motherboard, we want to ensure that our RAM is also compatible with both CPU and motherboard. Now that you know a little bit about the RAM sticks, I'll go ahead and install them. Before installing the RAM sticks into any of the slots, any of the 4 slots, I went ahead and read the motherboard's manual for recommendations on which slots exactly to insert when you have 2 RAM sticks. When putting in the RAM sticks, there's a tab right here on the end, and just flip it down just to allow the RAM stick to slide in. When installing the RAM stick, there's only one way the RAM stick can go in. To ensure that the RAM sticks are in correctly, you're going to hear a click. May need to use 2 hands for this. And there you go. Now I'm going to go ahead and install the second one. And once again, to make sure that the RAM stick is inside, you're going to hear a click. And there you go. And now I'll be covering the storage devices for this desktop build. For this desktop build, I went with the 250GB SSD NVMe M.2, which is right here. And to insert this storage device onto the motherboard, the connection is right there. I went with the storage device for its speed and as well its size. Now I'm going to install the storage device. Be sure that the SSD got inserted all the way fully. To hold the SSD storage device down, I will need to put a screw on this end. And there you go. That's the storage device inserted onto the motherboard. You may notice that there's no graphics card in the expansion slot, and that's because I'll be going with the built-in graphics card that the CPU has. If the built-in graphics card of the CPU is not enough, then I'll install a graphics card. One more thing about the motherboard, you have your input and output connections. You have an HDMI, and then you have your USB port, Ethernet port, audio port. And lastly, here's the case. I'll zoom in so you can take a closer look. Below here is where your power supply unit will be placed. Inside there's two 2.5 storage slots. If you have 2.5 storage devices, this is where you would place them. Inside we have a fan as well. And that where you see the hole is where the motherboard will be placed. And on top you have your power button, your reset button, input output for the audio, and then your USB connection. The motherboard comes with an input output shield, and so we're going to have to install it in the back of the case. It's easier if you have your case laying down. There you go, that's installed. And now to install the motherboard into the case. Inside the case there's some holders. You need to align the holes on the motherboard to these holders as we're going to screw it down. As I mentioned before, the motherboard has input and output connection, and so you want to align it with that shield, the IOD shield that was shown earlier. Aligning the motherboard may take a while, just gotta give it some patience. And now, on to making the connections from the front panel to the motherboard. And this is the other side of the case. The cables that you see outside will be connected onto the motherboard, which lead to the buttons that were in the front of the case. I went ahead and used the motherboard's manual to look where the connections were made. This right here is the USB connection to the front panel. This connection right here is for the audio, for the front panel connections. And that's where the audio connection goes. Now that all the connections in the front panel were made onto the motherboard, I'm going to install the power supply unit. This is a semi-modular power supply unit, which means that some cables are internally soldered into the power supply, such as these two. One goes to the CPU and the other goes to the motherboard. You can go online and find calculators that help calculate the power that is required by your desktop build. RAM, storage, graphic cards, and motherboard do play a factor in which power supply unit you need. So the power supply unit goes below the chases. Here I'm going to go ahead and install it. The power supply requires for it to be screwed onto the chases. Inside the box of the power supply unit has some screws. Now that the power supply is screwed onto the chases, let's go back and connect the power cables onto the motherboard. This is for the motherboard. And there's only one way that the power supply can go in. Always double check that the connections are made fully. You don't want to have a loose connection somewhere on your motherboard. And this one right here is for the CPU. All connections have been fully made onto the motherboard. And here you can see from the outside of the case that the motherboard has successfully been mounted. Now for the moment of truth. Let's give it some power and see if it turns on. Alrighty, the next thing you want to do is have a monitor and connect it to the desktop, and as well as a keyboard and connect it to the desktop. I'm using a wireless keyboard, so it doesn't really matter if it's wired or wireless, as long as you connect it to the correct input in the back of your desktop. Here I have a keyboard that has a mouse pad on the right, and then the monitor is right there. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the desktop and let's see if it worked. And there you have it. The desktop has been successfully built. There we are able to get to the BIOS setup. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope this video was helpful. Keep an eye out for the videos to come to this channel. For my next project, I'm thinking about disassembling an old speaker. See you until next time.